Were you involved in that in work wise?
I can't literally remember the date, Robert, but
No, neither can
I
I.
remember joining it will have been one of the first committees of the Association for Supported Employment. Yeah, I actually did join the committee at some point in its earliest days, I think.
I think me and you haven't crossed in AFSE and base
No,
because
no,
I,
I've
I, I
left.
sort of opted out for about 10 years, and it was
Yeah,
Hugh who persuaded me in for a
yeah,
year.
I think you would probably say that I persuaded Hugh to join AFSE. I joined at a time when I think the chair was a lady called Krista Hazelwood, and there was a
Yes,
guy called Tom Jackson there that convinced me to
yeah.
kind of get involved. And I think as I was. I think I might have been guilty of introducing Hugh to it, and then I think as I introduced him, I bowed out. The reason I bowed out, Robert, I've got to say, was that, and this is nothing against the association, but the association for me at that time, and what there were a
It
number of
lost its way, I believe.
well,
I
there
think
were a
that
number,
was the politest way I felt until Chris Hazelwood or Chris Easelwood, she was pivotal on bringing it back on track again.
yeah,
And
she
I think
was. She worked really
and
hard.
then it was then with Hugh. I think there was a moment for where it was really good, and it lost its way a little bit in the late 1990s, I think.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, the truth of all of that was as well that the association, there was a lot of infighting.
Yeah.
People used to have meetings and they talk about fundraising and where the funds were going and all kinds of things like that. The issue over time, the issue that I had was that what I will say, Robert, there weren't, and I don't know. Somebody would have to tell me now, but I don't believe there's ever been a real movement of employment services, if you like, that bring together those people that are focusing on people who are in the daycare system or
No.
and the issue that I had was that I very much felt supported employment, the American model that we and I'm quite happy to say we nicked that model and brought it in. This notion of job coaching, job training, using Mark Goldman Associates training stuff to do that. We definitely brought that across from the US. But then what happened was that I started to go to meetings with lots of people who really were working with people that I remember the job centre and the career service should have been working with. And my view was that the money that social services were giving me and my service, that was primarily for those people who were much further away from the employment market. These are people that the job centre used to turn away. They saw these folk as unemployable, and
Yeah.
those were the people that I felt this
And
funding
I still
should.
think to this day, procurement is still the biggest one. And with you, I want to go on to procurement because I'll sort of a little bit further ahead. I remember in the 1990s, you were given the opportunity to move your organisation out of Stockport Council into being, I think it was a CIC, a community interest company,
Do you
or
know? Do you know again what's interesting, Robert? There is that. Do you know what that didn't happen
did it not?
until. Well, it did. It did, but not until
Right.
2005.
Was it 2005? Oh,
Yeah, it was. Yeah. So again, just very quickly, what was interesting about that Stockport model, we we ran the supported employment service called WorkLink for a couple of years, and again, I think Stockport were really brave. And I mean, by Stockport, I mean Stockport Council.
yeah.
I was very lucky in that I reported in at assistant director level. So I had some, as you know, in local authorities, it's a very political environment. And to put it bluntly, I don't know if it's the same now, but the higher up the tree you are, the more you get listened to and the more opportunities you have to write reports that go to council committee and stuff like that. So I make no bones about that. There's a very political
Yes.
side to it.
Bureaucratic political end
Yeah,
to it.
yeah, very, very political side. But I was very lucky. in that my manager was an assistant director. He was completely, like the rest of the team I mentioned to you in the hospital, he was completely committed to care in the community. So I was very lucky to have this manager. And basically what this manager ultimately said was, well, employment is the thing that is ultimately going to mean that our day services can change and ultimately close down. So why don't we make you the manager of not just the employment side of things, but the day centre side of things? So around 1991, this is probably what you're thinking of, I then took over most of, not all, most of the day services that we had in Stockport. And interestingly enough, Robert, that's when, I mean, that allowed me to become more committed to the cause, but that took me into a completely different work area, because what I then became, and what I had to really sort of think about, work on really hard, was change management. How do you start to change? It's a bit like, you see, Robert, what happened, we're very clever really, because I sat there moaning about how disgusting it was that we had all these places that we put people away in and how terrible these places were. And then somebody had the bright idea of saying, okay, then put your money where your mouth is, you go and change them. That was quite a, and suddenly you're faced with this change management program, if you like. They're just this project where you've got these very, very institutionalized places that you're suddenly responsible for trying to move on.
Hammersmith was interesting because we were the employment service, and I think because we were an employment service right from the beginning, it had we had that sort of political will of the top right from the beginning. So I think that helped. So I think you moving to your role was Stockport giving you the political will of doing that, which was, I think, a really interesting point. And I think
it was a bit of a
need for that.
chalice.
Yeah, of course it is.
Because
I'm sure it gave you many sleepless nights.
Well, I think, Robert, to be honest with you, thinking that you came to see me around 1988, and in those days I was heavily involved in the world of supported employment, although I remained heavily committed to that world. If you think about it, then my job changed in that I then was just, I had this program of trying to change things across a number of day services. And the truth is that, you see, there was no way that you could give me that job and overnight I could get 300 people out of a day centre and into a job. So what I had to do then was work out things we could do that could move the day centres more towards the real world, an ordinary world, but also move them more towards employment. And that's how
So when you start creating a few social firms, and
we did all sorts of things like turning the canteen in a day centre into an ordinary restaurant that we hope people would come in. That wasn't a restaurant, and into an.
I understand. I mean, it's sort of moving it into actually giving people some real work opportunities, and moving things away from that old-fashioned day centre model, which was pretty awful.
The truth is, it was anything really that gave people who were in the day centre. We would open any project that gave people in the day centre a more valued role, something in the community where the community would turn around and look at what people were doing and say, that's really good. I come to your cafe, or thank you for. One of the main issues in Stockport at the time, would you believe, because I had access to all the council papers, and it sounds ever so middle class now, but one of the main issues to Stockport residents was their green spaces and the state of their green spaces. We had parks that were going to rack and ruin. So we started things almost like ground force type projects, where people, instead of going to the day centre, would work with people to renovate the park areas, and we take over maybe the cafe in the park and start to open that up to the public.
Do you have a park called Edgeley or something like that? I remember going to one sometime, I think in the late 2000s.
Yeah, I think we did have we had we had these projects literally all over the place, Robert. To be honest with you, and even that place that I remember, we had one in Bramall Park, one in Etherow Park. We had them all over the
It's
place.
probably one. It'd be one of the parks. I mean,
We didn't just do the park stuff. That makes sense. In the way that by this stage, by the way, Robert, we weren't just doing we weren't just working alongside people with learning disability. By this stage, along with Hugh and Barry, we'd started to expand to work with people from mental health services.
Yeah, because you had, was it the runner to the health and work program? It was at that time. It was work.
Yeah,
choice, was it?
we had work choice, then work step, I think,
Work
which
step.
we had
It was interesting because I joined Status, and Status didn't have work step. We had New Deal for disabled people. But what was very interesting, I met an old a person who worked for you, Chris Boulderstone.
right.
And what was very, very interesting, your model in the work step was exactly the same as my model at Status was with SLAM and with the National Autistic Society and Southdown Housing, where we looked at having internal audits, we looked at actually trying to do quality between ourselves. We had a very, very low fee for actually being the prime contractor. I mean, and it was very interesting. You could put both of our models side by side. And I think what upsets me a lot nowadays is the fact that the way that procurement quality was never in both WorkStep and NDDP towards the end of that time, and this might sound technical to people, but they didn't value quality as much as I did and you did.
Yeah, crikey, there was a big debate about quality in those days. But what I will say is that the other thing around this work step and all that kind of stuff, what really was important to me in our world, where we were trying to get people who were very, very distant from the employment market, who job centres, well, to put it bluntly, the main services that government and to some degree local government were funding, including colleges, the people that I was working with, they weren't touching with a barge pole, to put it bluntly.
Yeah.
And what my mini mission was to get their money, to get some of their money, whether that was job centre money, Department of Work and Pensions money, education money. I didn't care where the money came from, but I wanted to get a cut of that money and bring it to our people, because if I'd have taken my 300 people in the day centre and taken to the job centre and said, these people want to work, it's your job to get them a job, of course they would have said, no chance, no way. They'd have done it in a very clever way. They would have done some fancy assessment that said that people were incapable of work and they should be claiming non-work benefits. But I knew that a lot of those people could work, but there was no funding for them. And it felt very unfair to me to think that we had to use social services funding to fund things because of the deficits in the career service and the job centres, and all the other people, by the way, that the job centre were funding to get people into work, who also, if I'd have taken my people to those agencies and said, you're being paid to get people into work, can you work with our people? They would have also said no. So part of getting into that world, Robert, was about me trying to bring social services people closer to where the funding was.
Yeah, I think it's exactly the same as where we were going with Status, where we were using the money that we were getting from the New Deal for disabled people to actually backfund other areas where there wasn't enough money to help people who were further away from the labour market.
Yeah, exactly. And my guess is that it's still exactly the same today. I think it's still, and in actual fact, going back to what I was saying, that for a long time, the people in my organisation did feel very alone, because we were an organisation that was pretty much 100% focused on working with anybody really who was very distant from the labour market. And like I said, by this stage, we're working with people who were in sheltered workshops because they had a physical disability. We're working with people who were in the mental health system. We started to work with some people, young people in the care system, another system that's incredibly broken, where people are extremely devalued and don't feature don't really attract any of the mainstream funding because they're seen as far too difficult for
Do you
people
think
to
that
work.
you did that because of your starting off? Because I still have that where I feel that that's the main part of what we should be doing.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you think that's come because of your starting off in the 1980s where you saw everything like we saw? Do you think that is?
Yeah, well, it was two things, Robert, wasn't it? It was having come from a mainstream background at job centres and career
Yeah,
service and seeing that, and that system, as it were, was failing, and then going into a system that was even more deficit in terms of funding, ambition for people, and also, of course, yeah, it was very much driven by seeing people who were being abused. You
yeah,
know, almost everybody in these services was abused in
yeah.
some way.
It was
And
appalling,
it may not be physical, but if you think about people living in these places, going to these places for the rest of their lives doing jigsaw puzzles, using colouring in books, it was appalling, the things that I
yeah.
saw when I took over the day services. The activities that adults were meant to be doing that were being paid for and funded. And of course, then the problem is that the families think that that's all that people are capable of doing.
Yeah.
And when you go to see the families, they're so scared that they will lose those places that they don't want you to touch.
It's a mantra of mine constantly about raising aspirations. We have to raise aspirations. You can't raise aspirations if people are actually in those centres and they are being treated how they were. We could never do that. But I think in support employment, we have managed to raise aspirations. I look at things now and there is hope. I like the idea that we have supported internships, that people with learning disabilities can now actually go to college and actually have an internship. There's things now I look at and think, sometimes when I look and think, oh, we haven't achieved anything, then I look and think, yes, we have actually moved things forward tremendously.
We tried, I think, Robert, in Stockport, probably maybe there's a new model out there, but we tried every model under the sun, really, because I remember with you that we were talking about before, with you, we put together a European funded project called Embracing Diversity. And this was an interesting model because in Embracing Diversity, what we tried to do there was to get employers as the lead agency, if you like. So it was the employers that led the way, almost through a HR system. And really looking at embracing diversity now, that was undoubtedly the forerunner of some of these larger, what did you call them that you're currently seeing, Robert? What was
supported internships?
Yeah, the internship. Yeah. That was exactly the kind of model.
And you see now DPD and a number of organisations running their own internships, and it's brilliant.
Yeah, it is. The problem is that I guess that most people who are in day centres still don't get a sniff at it, though, Robert.
No, there'll always be that, and it will constantly be pushing that boulder up the hill to change. Can I ask you, were you the organisation that had the project that I always like the idea of, when young people who were wanting Saturday jobs got Saturday jobs and were supported by other young students who were wanting to move into the care system? Was it Pure who did that?
I'm not sure. It doesn't ring any bells with me. So I'm not going to now go in and say, oh, yeah, we have that model as well, because we probably didn't.
I always like that idea, is that the idea behind it. I always thought it was you, is that the person with learning disability who wanted a Saturday job but needed support was supported by a fellow student who was looking for working in social care and an idea. And there was a really good link. So the person with learning disability got the job, but they were talking to a fellow student who maybe was wanting to go to university, and it was raising both the people's aspirations. And I was always, it's a shame that model wasn't expanded. It was one of those that, I would like to do.
The truth of taking employment and putting that to one side, the truth of just integrating people is just integrate people.
Yeah.
The minute that somebody steps out the door and goes into anything that's special, whether that's special education, specialist part of the service, that if that funding can be redirected so that people never have to enter a special system, so that people are supported to enter the ordinary system, that's going to work. It's always going to work. But nobody ever gets it. I'm now too old to keep ranting about this, but nobody ever gets it. So we still have colleges where people will go to college and will never leave with a university place or a job or a what have you. We still have people who are going to school who will leave school and are heading for a day centre of some kind. Those things still exist.
It has always frustrated me is when you come across educators and other people who turn around to you and say, this person will never work. Because it's been proved since the 80s, actually, many people can and will do work. And what is needed is for everyone to change their attitude.
Yeah, it's just that there is definitely a need to fund support so that people from a very early age, from the very earliest stages of their life, can learn to be with the rest of us.
Yeah.
It's really that simple. But of course, to do that, people need lots of support to be able to engage with the rest of us. We all need some support, but some people need a lot more support, and that's where we should be putting the funding. The other thing I do want to mention to you, Robert, that you might have come across, because I was mentioning the things that really, if you like, influence the kind of supported employment that I was involved in. So, I have to give credit to the values base, to Mark Golden Associate, which also had an incredible values base. By the way, I need to mention a guy called Mark Feynman. Do you remember Mark?
Oh,
Feynman?
I do, yes.
Well, he was my mentor, and also a guy called Colin Goodwin. When I went on that second phase,
Colin from Liverpool.
Yeah, and Mark was working with Colin in Liverpool. And when Colin and I went on that second CSI training camp thing that they had, then Mark Feynman was the person who I trained with to learn how to deliver training properly. And Mark Feynman was pretty much alone in the UK in using those techniques on people who were in the challenging behaviour wards of the long stay hospital.
I think I met Colin in Interwork in Sheffield. I think he was working for Interwork in Sheffield.
And Mark will have been Interwork as well. You're absolutely right. Yeah, that's where.
And I think I met both of them in Interwork. And if I could get hold of Colin, I'd love to speak to Colin again.
Yeah. And they were working with people. Both Colin and Mark were working with people in a long-stay institution in Sheffield, and they were streets ahead.
Yes,
streets ahead of anything that anybody is. So again, they were an influence. But the other, when we in the late 1980s, when we put WorkLink together for Stockport Council, the one thing that I realised was missing then was the way that we approached employers. Interestingly enough, I didn't quite bump into, but I came across a guy called Kevin Hopton who was running sales training. Now, Kevin's background was nothing to do with our world at all. Kevin was training people in the newspaper industry how to sell newspaper advertising. Right, so that was, but he had this amazing sales training course that ran for 3 days. So I bought him in.
I think I may have also bought him in for Blake's as well.
Really interesting guy.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I was talking to Audrey Bodman, who now does very, very similar and really good employer engagement. And I've got an interview with her, so
Right,
you'll
that's
be interested in
interesting.
listening to her and her views on employer engagement. And of course,
Well,
before that, there was Fred Bowen from um, Base,
yeah,
who was also instrumental. I think the people who are into employer engagements is incredibly important. EUSC has just won an Erasmus around employer engagement, which is really, really good. So
right.
I
That
think
is
that is going to be
interesting.
good, because I think it's people forget it's a big tranche of what we're doing is bringing employers to the parties in really, really important things. So I'm pleased on behalf of European Union Supported Employment, and also that the British Association of Supported Employment are going to be part of that journey. I think is
I
going to
just
be really
think
good.
I just think it's really important, Robert, that we don't try to reinvent the wheel. So
No,
if you're employing people who've got to go out there and sell, and that's what we
yeah,
basically do. You've got to convince an employer to open the door and take a person into their place of work, then actually sales training is very relevant. The
yeah,
problem I had was with our industry was that we weren't really teaching people
no,
sales. We were teaching them some kind of soft marketing skills instead of how to actually sell. So,
right.
for example, people never used to sit in front of an employer or an owner or whatever and say, "So, can we have a job then?" They would talk at them for hours and hours and hours, and then come away and say, "Well,
You're going to have to listen to the Audrey Bodman one, because
I
I
think
was
we'll get
lucky.
on then."
I was lucky. One of my first ever jobs was selling health and safety training courses. So I came into this industry where I actually wasn't frightened of selling, and knew all about tie downs, and it's hugely important. And I think the people we employ don't like to think of themselves as salesmen, but
Well,
actually we have to sell to
you've
employers.
got to be very careful, Robert, because one of the issues I had was that we were trying at some point, and I used to teach selling, by the way. So I eventually, what happened was I co-trained with because I had the employment side of things, and he had the sales. We jointly did it for a while, and then ultimately I started delivering this sales training because I felt it was so important. But very often we would try to teach people who didn't want to sell and
Yeah.
couldn't sell to sell, and that's where you have to be really careful because
It's a debate, and I think this debate is going to go on in a series of interviews. And I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Audrey Bodman. I've always come from the bit where I wanted people to have the whole understanding and the selling and everything. And I know some people like to have a person who is specialist in selling. I'm going to ask you this question: which do you prefer? Do you prefer to have everyone doing a little bit, or do you prefer to have a specialist?
no, I actually do like everybody doing a little bit. I'll
Yeah.
tell you
Okay.
why.
You come down the same.
When we tried it the other way, the problem was that we'd have really good salespeople. But then the people who were training would be waiting for the really good salespeople to bring in the really
Yeah.
good jobs so they could go out and do some really good training. What I actually found worked for me was if you've got a really good salesperson and a really good trainer all in one, then that person can just
Yeah.
take a
No, no,
caseload of
you're on
people
the
and
same
get
page
on.
as me. I was just sort of, I'm going to ask most people this sort of question as I go
Yeah,
along.
yeah.
Um, I'm sort of coming to the end of the time of this, and we could go on for another hour or 2 hours, and it's been
No, we
really good,
couldn't. No,
good
we couldn't.
catching, good catching up with you. One of the things I do want to ask, and that is it is about procurement, because procurement in England has been so difficult at times, and I think we often miss the chance of actually helping the people we want to help. In your ideal world, how would you, when I call procuring for everyone else, I mean, how would you actually get funds to organizations so that they could actually help people with a learning disabilities, severe enduring mental health needs, autism? How would you actually deal with that? Because I think your views are really important.
I think the problem with that is probably, and again, you've got to understand that I'm not in this world, but I think the problem with that is probably still the same as it was when I was in this world, and that is that you've got to allocate resources across so many people fairly. So what does that mean? Well, as I said to you already, I think the issue is that if you are going to write off in the United Kingdom a whole section of people as unemployable, then you're never going to offer them the funding so that they are employed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what you have is those people who have been written off as unemployable are then relying on the services that are not necessarily anything to do with employment in the first place to fund them to get into the world of employment. None of that model makes sense. So what you do as a government, I think, is you start to actually count the number of people you've got who are seen as unemployable, but recognise that out of those unemployable cohort, you've got a significant number who we over years have proven will become economically active and are employable, and you allocate resources accordingly so that people are not scrabbling about competing with each other for the literally the crumbs at the pig pen, because that's what happens with procurement in employment in the UK. You are scrabbling about for crumbs at the pig pen with lots of other pigs. It's as simple as that. And I've never seen anything from any government that prioritises the people that I consider should be given the same opportunity as everybody else to go out and get a job.
Now, I would agree, and until that changes,
well,
for
it won't
me,
change, Robert.
until that changes, then we will have a big issue. Finally, and this is
can I just tell you that, Robert? But there is hope in that. It's not the model that I've just described to you. I don't believe that government are ever going to do that, regardless of which government are in, because I think they are inherently geared up to consider that there are lots and lots, thousands and thousands of people who will never get a job and therefore need to be shunted over there.
Yeah.
But when I told you that before we started the interview, I'd done some work with Essex Care Limited. Now, what was interesting was they took on this notion that if you take some of your money that you're spending on funding day services and fund employment out of that's the way to go. They started to do that, and they are actually very successful. Now, what
That's
that
great.
needed, yeah, it is, because what that needed from them was they had to be as bold as lions, because what they had to do was they had to fund that up front initially. What happens when you do that kind of funding, Robert, is you run in two kinds of funding. You run in the experimental money that you're shifting out of your day services to fund employment, but you're also having to maintain your day service. So it's expensive for a while. But of course, eventually, as people
then you start making the savings. I think there's been little bits of that, but I think I would agree with you that can go. I had some good funding or innovative funding with Croydon Council before they unfortunately went bankrupt, and that was a very good one of using personal budgets for self-employment. And that actually, we got people starting their own businesses, and it had tremendous success and was a really good use of funding. So I think, again, it's for me, it's often a play for commissioners to actually understand what they're trying to solve. And often there are going to be organizations like myself and like your organizations that will actually be able to help them with that. And I think it's sort of that joint thinking is often needed, but it's not always there.
No, it'd be great if Robert, I suppose, I mean, it's much more complicated even than we've got time for. But one of the things, it would be great if the people we're talking about, and that is right across the range, by the way. This is people who are homeless. This is people who are in mental health services, whatever. Right across the range, if those people were seen as having a right to employment funding, because and they're not. They're seen as being funded through health and social care. They've always been seen as being funded through health and social care and local authority rather than central government funding. And quite honestly, those services, your health service funding, your local authority funding, they've been absolutely decimated, particularly over the last 12 years. Their funding's been decimated. So it's become even more difficult. The pot's become even more smaller for those people who are trapped in those kind of local government and health funded and to some degree education services to get anywhere near funding to get them into employment. So that whole system needs changing, and it's a central government issue. It's a taxpayers issue. That's what it is. It's not a local taxpayer issue. It's a national taxpayer issue. But no government has ever created something that says...
This is why I call it like pushing a boulder up the hill, where you have to keep on pushing and pushing.
And somebody else is going to have to push it because I've given up.
Well, this is part of the reason I'm going to give... Actually, I want to sort of finish on a sort of high and a positive. What is... I mean, there's many things you should be proud of, because you actually... I think you've been one of the people that's been inspirational for so many people in actually getting supported employment in Britain and over in Europe off the ground. I think you've been one of the heroes for me.
I am, Robert.
No, but seriously, you're one of those people where, the word Doug Cresswell would, yes, he's one of the pioneers. And for me, finishing on something really high is one of the biggest things that you've been proud of in what I think has been a stellar career in helping the cause of support employment, helping more people with disabilities being able to get employment.
The only reason you do it really is to get... I think just before I left work, or maybe a year or so before I left work, I got an email from a parent who told me that his son was celebrating his 20th year in AFSE as an employee.
I had something so similar, and I think it's a good one because I had one where a parent had emailed me. Someone had been given an award from Marks and Spencer's as a till assistant, and it brought me to tears. It was ridiculous how happy that made me.
And the truth is, Robert, that the people that I've worked with, or if you like, that I've employed, that I've been their manager, if I talk to any of my old colleagues, the only thing that they ever talk with me about is the people that they've worked with, that they've got into jobs, that they've placed, that they've seen do really interesting things. Genuinely, I'm not saying this, that's what they want to talk about. So everybody I've ever employed or worked with, that's always, if I ever bump into, I could be bumping into them in a supermarket somewhere, and the first thing they'll want to talk about is, do you remember such and such a person? Well, would you believe I bumped into their mum the other day, and that's, they're travelling independently now, they're doing this, that's what they want to talk about. So what we need is more people who want to be driven by that as their reward. That's what we need, don't we?
And I think supported employment is full of those people, and you exemplify that. And so, Doug, thank you so much and I wish I had another hour or so, but thank you so much. It's been a pleasure catching up with you.
And Robert, I can't believe you've come all the way from Portugal to be with me today.
I know, all the way to Stockport. The weather's very English out there today.
It's great to catch up with you, Robert. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, bye.